An arrow cut the early morning fog like a silent verdict. It did not whistle like a bullet or bite like shrapnel. It sailed with a patient cruelty, a long, unhurried arc that belonged to another century. When it landed, a Wehrmacht sergeant crumpled into a hedgerow, surprised not only by the wound, but by the instrument of it, a 6-foot longbow, strung and held by a British officer whose silhouette looked more like a medieval reenactor than a modern soldier. They laughed at him. They called him mad. He answered with an arrow. This is the story of Jack Churchill, known in whispers and dispatches as Mad Jack, a man whose weapons read like a list of curiosities. A longbow that could have been at Agincourt, a basket-hilted broadsword that flashed in the sun, and a set of bagpipes whose keening was as unlikely on a battlefield as the longbow itself. He trained at Sandhurst, moved through the world before the war as a hunter, newspaperman, and obsessive performer of impossible skills. When Europe convulsed in 1939–40, he carried every talisman of his eccentricity into the chaos, convinced that warfare was as much about the mind as it was about guns and tanks. To understand why one man with ancient kit mattered in a war of blitzkriegs and armored columns, you need to see the stage. May 1940. The Wehrmacht's advance shattered the seams of Allied lines. Panzer spearheads and Luftwaffe dominance turned retreat into rout. Radioed orders tangled with mud and desperation. Men fell back across fields and roads, columns of soldiers and vehicles more intent on saving themselves than holding ground. In that fevered withdrawal, small encounters assumed outsized meaning. Morale shattered quickly. Fear bred more fear. Into that trembling space walked Jack Churchill, carrying objects that refused to belong to the moment. That deliberate discord, a sound and sight that didn't make sense in modern battle, became his weapon. The story that followed the arrow in the hedgerow is both fact and folklore. Contemporary reports would later call his shot at Lapinay the first confirmed longbow kill in centuries. Historians stress the word reported. Accounts vary and legend grows in the cracks between eyewitness testimony. Nevertheless, the image stuck. A solitary officer, calm as a huntsman, drawing a bow while the world around him seemed to be running on fire and oil. It was not theatricalism for its own sake. Churchill believed in psychological warfare long before doctrine manuals borrowed the phrase. He argued that fear was contagious and that shock, carefully introduced, could break an enemy's will more efficiently than any grenade. A sudden bagpipe lament at dawn, a sword flashing where no one expected steel, an archer who did not run, these, he taught himself, could create the wrong kind of terror, the irrational kind, in soldiers trained to respond to bullets and tanks, not to pageantry. His weapons were tools for dislocation as much for killing. The story that followed the arrow in the hedgerow is both fact and folklore. Contemporary reports would later call his shot at Lapinay the first confirmed longbow kill in centuries. Historians stress the word reported. Accounts vary and legend grows in the cracks between eyewitness testimony. Nevertheless, the image stuck. A solitary officer, calm as a huntsman, drawing a bow while the world around him seemed to be running on fire and oil. It was not theatricalism for its own sake. Churchill believed in psychological warfare long before doctrine manuals borrowed the phrase. He argued that fear was contagious and that shock, carefully introduced, could break an enemy's will more efficiently than any grenade. A sudden bagpipe lament at dawn, a sword flashing where no one expected steel, an archer who did not run. These, he taught himself, could create the wrong kind of terror, the irrational kind, in soldiers trained to respond to bullets and tanks, not to pageantry. His weapons were tools for dislocation as much for killing. When Dunkirk became a word for exodus and failure, the British Army shed much of its heavy equipment. There were stories of abandoned rifles, tanks scuttled or left to the tide, and men who, in panic, left their very names on the ground. Churchill refused to abandon his. He was told to discard his antiquities. He would not. He ferried himself back to England and remarked, as his contemporaries recalled, that he would not leave his tools of trade behind. They were a part of how he fought. They were part of who he was. Out of that retreat came a new kind of unit, the commandos. Conceived as fast, raiding forces capable of hitting coastal installations, artillery emplacements, and supply nodes, they were drawn from volunteers. Men who signed away the certainty of a conventional soldier's life for a kind of purposeful hazard. Training was brutal and selection merciless. Commandos were to be shock troops, comfortable with ambiguity, rapid insertion, and improvisation. To their commanders, Churchill's weapons were oddball eccentricity. To the men he led, they became a kind of talisman that promised spectacle and, more importantly, leadership of a kind that refused to flinch. If the Lapinette arrow was the emblem of his method, it was Maury Island that translated eccentricity into tactical legend. Maury Island, transcribed in some records as Voway Indefined, place name uncertain, verification advised, was a small outcrop where a German garrison manned a coastal battery. For an occupying force, artillery on such islands was an annoyance and a threat. For Churchill, it was a target and an opportunity to test everything he believed about surprise and panic. The raid was simple in conception and audacious in appearance. Under cover of darkness and a slow, indifferent sea, landing crafts nosed toward shingle and rock. The commandos moved like ghosts, wet boots, breath held, bayonets clipped. Churchill, however, chose a different cadence. He took to the surf with bagpipes strapped across his back, a broadsword at his hip, and a longbow slung like a relic of another age. The visual was absurd, until the moment it wasn't. A piping sound rose from the black water, a high, reedy drone that cut across waves and wind. For a second, in that peculiar acoustic space, the Germans were trying to interpret the meaning of a sound that belonged more to Highland glens than to a warship's wake. He strode ashore with the pipes calling and the sword flashing. In the confusion of surf, darkness, and an unexpected instrument of music, the defenders reacted like men startled in their sleep. Orders tangled. It was difficult to aim or to marshal a coherent defense against an attack whose rhythm and form were unfamiliar. Churchill led with speed and ruthless clarity. Where a Tommy with a Bren gun might have hesitated, this officer, using archaic iconography, turned disorientation into momentum. The emplacement was overrun, guns bunged or destroyed, and prisoners were taken. The raid was, by plan and by temperament, a small lesson in how perception shapes combat. What mattered was not only the material outcome, the guns silenced, the prisoners bagged, but the story it told afterward. Men who had watched a broadsword flashed in the surf and heard bagpipes drown out machine gun crack spoke of it in bunkers and mess huts. Reports filtered up. The man who went ashore with the pipes had cut down any pretense that war must be only iron and rules. It was here, among tidal stones and wrapped in shell splinters, that Churchill's reputation hardened into legend among the commandos. Legend and fact braided together everywhere Mad Jack went. Some contemporaries praised him with near religious fervor for the morale effect he delivered. Others found him reckless, a needlessly theatrical hazard. Both were true in different measures. The sound of bagpipes at a seaside raid did not win the war, but it could, and did, tip a particular skirmish towards success by fostering confusion and seizing the initiative. His colleagues in the fledgling commando units were a mix of career soldiers and men drawn to the theater of it all. Figures like Lieutenant Colonel John D. Slater, who helped shape early commando doctrine, and men such as Bertram James, who would later be known for his own audacious escape attempts from captivity, moved in the same orbit. Peter Young, among others, chronicled the early days of the commandos and provided context for how raids that might seem eccentric at first contributed to a doctrine of special operations that prized speed, surprise, and psychological pressure as much as firepower. Churchill's methods were not only useful in assault, they were a form of leadership by example. In small boats and on stormy beaches, a leader who refused to be cowed exercised a contagious authority. Soldiers are, in their more human moments, barometers of the confidence of their commanders. The man who strode into surf with a sword and played a tune while shells echoed inland demonstrated a confidence that could steady a frightened unit. Commandos learned not only to imitate him, but to incorporate the idea that unpredictability could be weaponized. By making themselves strange, they made their enemies uncertain. After Moy, stories proliferated. Some were modest and verifiable, that guns were put out of action, that prisoners were taken, that morale among the men who followed him rose measurably in the immediate aftermath. Others were less cleanly proven. One contemporary rumor, which would later be repeated in press and memoirs, suggested that during moments of the retreat he accounted for multiple German non-commissioned officers in quick succession. Some accounts would even condense several incidents into a 3-day frenzy, attributing to him as many as 7 German sergeants felled in that period. The proper historian must treat such claims with care. The numbers, where not borne by documentary evidence, are reported or attributed, not established. But the function of the rumor was important in itself. Whether precisely true or not, it fed into a narrative that made commandos and the British public believe that audacity could turn the tide of isolated encounters. There is a moral complexity beneath this mythology that rarely makes it into a punchline or a medal citation. When a rifle bullet or an arrow ends a life, there is a human consequence that cannot be glossed over by cleverness. Churchill did not romanticize bloodshed. He treated his instruments as means to specific ends, and he bore the same weight as other soldiers when death followed. His bagpipes provided solace and a sharp edge of defiance. His sword and bow were instruments of lethal effect. The men on the receiving end of his actions were more than placeholders in a legend. They were people whose lives and families were altered. To tell Mad Jack's story honestly is to feel both admiration for his courage and the sober gravity of the harm war causes. Moy Island rippled into the larger story of British raids that year. The commandos were proving a concept. Small, well-trained units could inflict disproportionate damage far behind enemy lines. That doctrine would seed the special operations forces to come. Churchill's flamboyance helped write a template, not the template itself, but an illustration of how morale, noise, and spectacle can be folded into military effectiveness. Yet even as his legend grew, so did the pragmatic questions. How sustainable was this style of fighting? How would archaic weaponry fare in protracted engagements? These concerns mattered less to Churchill than the immediate logic of each fight. Create surprise, seize the initiative, and amplify fear. He saw himself as an exponent of a psychology of combat. If your enemy cannot think clearly, he cannot fight effectively. This mindset would pull him across theaters and finally into actions that were less controlled than a coastal raid, into the rugged and chaotic fights of Mediterranean campaigns and partisan warfare in the Balkans. Before those chapters opened, there was a brief moment, measured in months, in conversations, in interpersonal tensions, where he had to convince others to carry on with him. Command structures rarely reward eccentricity without proof of result. Mad Jack produced those proofs with a combination of luck, timing, and raw nerve. He also paid for them. Raids like Moy were not cost-free. Men were wounded, equipment lost, and the emotional toll of close fighting lingered. For many who followed him, the man who laughed at danger was, beneath the bravado, a compass of purpose in a war where purpose often felt thin. After the Moy operation, orders and reassignment pulled units to different coasts and then farther afield. Churchill's particular path bent toward the Mediterranean, where campaigns in Sicily and Salerno awaited. Theaters of different soil and climate, of mountain warfare and urban chaos. He would bring his longbow, his broadsword, and his pipes across the continent, and each instrument would play a role, sometimes symbolic, sometimes tactical, often both. But before those sunburnt hills and confused mountain passes, there remained the immediate aftermath, the consolidation of morale, the quieting of men who had watched a broadsword bite the night. Reports made their rounds in messes and telegrams, and a reputation began to accrete in the ways reputations do, partly on deeds, partly on retelling. When soldiers later sat with a drink and traded the day's oddities, Mad Jack's name surfaced like a coin polished by many palms. That attention lent him a useful invisibility in some instances. Officers and soldiers who expected the conventional now hesitated in the face of the unconventional. It is tempting, in a narrative like this, to strain every story into a neat moral. Courage rewarded, eccentricity vindicated. The record resists such compression. There are decisions Churchill made that were undeniably effective, and others that were borderline reckless. He courted danger with a zeal that was sometimes inspirational and sometimes dangerous. The line between audacity and recklessness is thin in war, and men walking it often find themselves tested by mischance as much as by enemy fire. Even so, if you trace the lineage of modern special operations back through the mud and surf of 1940, you find in Churchill an important conceptual ancestor, the man who treated warfare as a theater of perception, who weaponized the unexpected, and who insisted that morale and psychology were legitimate arenas of conflict. His style would be copied and refined, minus the longbow in most cases, by officers who prioritized speed, stealth, and shock over attrition. As he prepared to move into Italy and beyond, the rumors thickened and the stories multiplied. Some contemporaries saw in him an anachronism, a living museum piece. Others saw a practitioner of a brutal, effective art. If the Lepinette arrow had been the image that announced his arrival, the Mott-Ho-He landing was the demonstration that he could convert eccentricity into military effect. That combination made his name travel faster than maps. If you listen for a moment to the archive of memory, you hear in the echoes not only bagpipes and the thud of an arrow, but also questions about how myths are made. The tale of 7 sergeants in 3 days, invoked in rumor and headline, but thin on documentary proof, tells you less about precise accounting than about the appetite of a public hungry for heroes in a dark year. Soldiers needed stories to stabilize a world gone unstable. The press, hungry for striking copy, was glad to oblige. The truth sits somewhere in the ledger between the two. Acts of daring that were real, numbers that were small and sometimes exaggerated, and a persona that amplified the deeds into something greater. Even as the legend spread, his life moved forward in a sequence ripe with contradictions. The man who refused to discard a medieval bow yet learned modern commando tactics. The leader who would sound a tune while shells fell around him. The eccentric whose choices saved lives as often as they imperiled them. In the short term, these contradictions worked to his advantage. The enemy hesitated, the field tilted, and a handful of men survived to fight another day. The next moves would take him into warmer seas and more tangled politics. Sicily's sunlit ridges, Salerno's violent beaches, and later grim encounters with partisan warfare in the Balkans. Each theater would ask new things of him, press his methods into novel service, and in the process deny the simplicity of a hagiography. There would be triumphs and tragedies. There would be capture and imprisonment. There would be escapes and long walks home. But those are chapters for another stretch of the story. If this moment means anything, it is that anachronism can be a weapon when wielded with conviction. An arrow is only as effective as the hand that lets it fly, and a bagpipe is only a noise until someone decides to make it a signal. Jack Churchill decided, repeatedly, to make his noises mean things. He took the gamble that theater could become tactic, and time and again the gamble paid off, sometimes in moments of practical victory, sometimes in the creation of a legend that would outlast its maker. If you want more forgotten war stories like this, tap like. It helps spread these true stories. Even with the applause of history beginning to gather around his exploits, not everything that follows was applause. The very boldness that produced the arrow in the hedgerow and the pipes on the shore would also lead him into darker valleys and into confrontations that stripped away the glamour. When you next see him, it will be on different ground: boot-sucked hills, partisan trails, and nights where the only music was the far-off echo of artillery. There, his belief in shock and spectacle would be tested against the grim arithmetic of attrition and the fragile loyalty of irregular allies. But before the Mediterranean sun and the partisan hills, there was work to do, orders to follow, and a reputation to manage. Commandos reassigned, plans rewritten, and small boats slid quietly into new coves. For Mad Jack, the world was still a place in which anachronistic instruments could be brought to bear on modern problems. He would carry his bow, sword, and pipes not as props but as instruments, for disruption, for morale, and for the stubborn assertion that sometimes the strangest tool is the one the enemy expects least. He carried on into the warmer light of the Mediterranean as if the sea itself were another stage for his peculiar toolbox. The landings in Sicily brought entirely different demands than hedgerow skirmishes and tidal raids. Here the ground rose and fell in terraces, olive groves hid sentries, and narrow roads funneled columns into predictable patterns. Yet the principle that had guided him at Mai did not change. Exploit surprise, make the enemy misread the moment, force a decision they had not prepared for. The island was a study in contrasts. Beaches were broad and sunburnt, but the interior folded into centuries of terracing and stone walls that turned a small unit's advance into a set of choke points. In those places, a distracted sentry could be the fulcrum that swung a whole ridge. Churchill moved through Sicily with the same appetite for unpredictability that had taken him ashore on cold nights. A propensity to choose the most conspicuous means and make the conspicuous work, whether by breaking rhythm or by using the bizarre to disrupt the expected. Accounts of the Sicilian operations often stress the improvisational quality of commando work. Supply was thin, coordination was difficult. The advantages of heavy firepower were sometimes negated by terrain and time. Mad Jack's peculiarities fit the gaps. A sudden appearance on a ridge, a sword flashing through moonlight, a bagpipes keening carried down a valley. These were not merely ostentation. They were instruments in his repertoire for manipulating an enemy's state of mind. When men trained to fight tanks and rifles encountered gestures that did not compute, their reactions were not reliably rational. That hesitation, of a second or two, is often the margin between capture and escape. In Sicily, he found new audiences for his method. Groups of ill-prepared defenders, garrison infantry rotated in from dull inland postings, and small units guarding crossroads who had yet to confront the theatrical violence of a commando raid. The biggest leap, in the literal and narrative sense, was Salerno. The Allied landings there in September 1943 brought armored columns, naval gunfire, and a contested beachhead. Commandos were used as advance parties, reconnaissance, and disrupted elements placed where nimble violence could have strategic effect. Mad Jack's role in these operations was typical of his career. He pressed into points most others considered marginal, and in doing so created opportunities beyond himself. It was during one of these Mediterranean missions that he and an audacious companion, several reports named the location as Melina, a mountain pass or village, some sources use the same name with different spellings, achieved what would be narrated later in breathless terms. Two men, moving at night and reading the land as if it were a map of intentions rather than merely of stones, closed on a group of enemy soldiers quartered in a farmhouse and its outbuildings. The exact details of the approach, the words exchanged, and the precise count of prisoners are debated in memoir and report. What contemporary records do indicate is that a two-man infiltration, relying on stealth, audacity, and the implicit threat of violence, resulted in a disproportionate surrender. Some accounts insist that as many as 42 enemy soldiers were taken in that action by the audacity of two men who refused to be contained by numbers. Historians who re-examine those stories tend to label the numbers as reported rather than established. But the core fact that a tiny unit could exploit surprise to capture a much larger group is consistent across sources. Consider for a moment the barber pin logic of such an exploit. Two men move with silence and daring into a night where noise is presumed to herald force. They appear where the occupiers expect none. They brandish unexpected weaponry, and they threaten violence with a clarity that is hard to resist in the small hours. A sword is a symbol as much as it is a blade. It communicates an immediate and personal danger. The psychology of surrender in that setting is simple and brutal. Faced with the immediate prospect of close-quarters killing or capture by a force they cannot see or measure, many enemy soldiers prefer the orderly constraint of being prisoners. If the counts are inflated in the legends that followed, the qualitative point remains. The seizure of initiative by an unpredictable attacker could collapse the will of a defender who assumed the encounter would be conventional. But for every successful, almost cinematic take of prisoners, there were operations that eroded the sheen of that bravado. The Balkans would be an acute reminder of the moral and operational complexities of irregular warfare. British liaison with Yugoslav partisans brought commandos into an arena where the enemy was not always neat, and the Allies were often not seamlessly reliable. Josip Broz Tito's partisans were formidable in their knowledge of terrain and in their political determination. They were also a coalition of fighters with their own claims and rivalries. Working with them required not merely courage, but political sensitivity and a degree of mutual trust that was never guaranteed. It was in the tangled hills and uncertain allegiances of Yugoslavia that one of the most harrowing episodes of Churchill's war unfolded. The partisans cooperated with commando raids that aimed to hit German positions and disrupt communications. But the fog of war there was dense with more than smoke. On one operation, in the collapse between daylight and dark, a sudden mortar salvo, perhaps miscalculated, perhaps aimed at a concentration of men, struck where Churchill's detachment was operating. Men he had led and who trusted him were killed. In the immediate chaos, he did something that would be remembered in stark, unadorned terms. He took up his bagpipes and played. That image, a leader, piping while bodies lay around him and shells still spoke in the air, is one that sits uncomfortably between defiance and grief. Some witnesses described it as a way of steadying men, a ritual to hold the living together in a moment when order had dissolved into shock. Others read it as an act of stubbornness, a refusal to let violence extinguish a mode of expression that had come to mean resilience in his hands. Whatever the interpretation, the act did not protect him. Later that day, the Germans apprehended him. Reports vary on the precise circumstances of his capture. Partisan alliances, local skirmishes, and the fog of irregular war make the sequence hard to lock down with exactness. What is clear is the result. He was now a prisoner of the Wehrmacht. The life of officers in captivity was a world bounded by fences, watchtowers, and a quotidian rhythm of humiliation and small rebellions. Churchill's internment took him to Sachsenhausen. The name is rarely spoken without the chill that the German prison system imposed on its inmates. Sachsenhausen was no ordinary POW camp. It had been a site of terror and death before the war's end, and life within its perimeters was grueling. Prisoners suffered from inadequate food, harsh labor, and constant psychological pressure. Churchill, like many others, quickly assessed that survival required more than stoicism. It demanded imagination. Escape was an obsession in many POW camps. It was both a moral duty lodged in military culture and a practical attempt to rejoin the fight. Among officers who plotted escapes, there was an engineering of hope.
Tunnels bored under barracks, forged documents, walks timed to enemy shifts. Churchill participated in these projects with the same stubborn inventiveness he brought to a shoreline raid. On September 23, 1944, a tunnel escape was attempted from Sachsenhausen. Contemporary sources record that a cohort of prisoners took the risk. Some made it out into the night air, while others were recaptured. The details are at once dramatic and bureaucratic. Names listed in after-action reports, testimonies filed in dusty archives, and an atmosphere of both triumph and recrimination for failures and partial successes. Churchill was among the escapees who at first made headway. For a while, there was the intoxicating possibility of distance, fences behind, the uncertain freedom of roads and forests ahead. That liberty, however, was fragile. German patrols, local informants, and the sheer difficulty of moving undetected in a landscape increasingly hostile to fugitives meant that many escapees were soon recaptured. Churchill's own route led him toward the Baltic shores, the sea a pale boundary that might have promised transit and confusion to a fleeing soldier. He was seized near the coast and sent on a transfer that would take him away from Sachsenhausen and into the long, grinding movement of prisoners as the Reich's eastern front collapsed.
The transfer route ran south and into Austria as front lines shifted and the German transport system frayed. Months of travel in guarded columns, shared cells, and sideways glances culminated in final liberation as Allied forces pushed through Austria in the spring of 1945. But liberation did not simply unspool into immediate homeward movement. There were the practicalities of accounting for prisoners, treating illness and injuries, and the moral work of reintegration. Churchill, when finally free, did not accept transport at once. In an almost emblematic act, recorded in after-action accounts and veteran reminiscences, he walked. The figure often repeated in narratives is a march of roughly 150 kilometers back to Allied lines, a long, exhausting trek that was less a romantic image than a wearying reality, full of blisters, hunger, and the slow reintroduction of agency to men who had been confined for months. The return to normal life for men like Churchill was never simple. A temperament forged for danger and unmoored by captivity has difficulty finding purchase in peacetime routines. For some, the end of hostilities brought relief. For others, it brought a kind of restlessness that had nothing to do with the thrill of youth and everything to do with how purpose had been organized in their lives. Churchill belonged to the latter group. His post-war years read like the same man trying new acts of audacity in a landscape without bullets. He returned to Britain and a country itself exhausted by years of rationing and loss. The public, hungry for heroes and stories that stitched defeat into meaning, welcomed odd tales. Churchill, never a man to shrink from attention, cultivated an image that married his wartime legend with peacetime eccentricity. He turned to pursuits that echoed his earlier habits: long walks by rivers, experiments with small crafts, and the occasional demonstration that refused to be quaint. One famous anecdote tells of him surfing the River Severn in a rudimentary fashion, a stunt that combined balance, bravado, and a refusal to accept the dullness of domesticity. Another tells of a briefcase trick on a train, a performative contrivance that used misdirection and timing to produce delight or irritation, depending on the observer's patience. These acts were not meaningless. They were continuations of his method, now repurposed for civilian margins rather than military ones. They were still ways of saying, quietly and often publicly, that he would not be domesticated. Recognition came in part as medals and in part as a place in the stories told by soldiers who had watched him lead. The honors he received were not solely because of a bow or a tune, but because his presence had been consequential. Men had been steadied by his example. Outcomes had been altered by his dislocation of the enemy, and the doctrine of small unit shock and surprise had, in embryonic form, him among its practitioners. He was sometimes called anachronistic, sometimes a tactical prophet. The truth, as always, sat between the claims. In the post-war debates about the origins of special operations, Churchill's name loomed as an eccentric founder figure, a man whose theatricality forced historians to reckon with the role of personality in doctrine. Modern special forces owe much to the ideas that commandos embodied: speed, initiative, the preference for strategic effect over massed attrition. Churchill's contribution was less a set of formal innovations than a living demonstration of how radical behavior could force an opponent to miscalculate. That lesson, absorbed and refined, would inform training regimens that stripped away the longbow and kept the intent. Shape the battlefield by altering your opponent's expectations. Even as the military community and the public debated his legacy, a quieter conversation emerged about the cost at which such heroics came. When history frames someone as a near-mythic figure, a man who could take on whole groups with nothing but a sword and a grin, it sometimes marginalizes the cost paid by subordinates and enemies alike. Churchill's tombstone of legend sometimes seduced audiences into glossing over the personal tragedies that attended his campaigns. Young men killed in ambushes, the terror of villages caught between partisan and occupying forces, and the moral muddle of irregular warfare where front lines and civilians blurred. These lingering shadows complicated the celebratory accounts of his daring and forced a more sobering appraisal of what audacity means in war. In the decades that followed, historians returned to the fragments, to telegrams, to after-action reports, to photographs and diaries, to parse what was genuinely attributable to Churchill and what had accreted around him in the years when stories were currency. The shot at Leponet retained its emblematic power. The Moy landing did too. Molina's two-man capture remained a standard anecdote in military studies of psychological warfare. The larger pattern most scholars accepted was this: Churchill was a capable, often brilliant small unit leader who deliberately exploited perception to disadvantage the enemy. He took risks that sometimes paid off spectacularly. Those risks sometimes ended poorly or cost others dearly. The myth that wrapped itself around him served social and cultural functions. It gave soldiers models of courage, it provided journalists with vivid copy, and it allowed a nation to imagine singular figures who could alter the flow of events with personality as much with policy. In classrooms where military history is taught, Mad Jack frequently appears as a study in the uses and limits of personality in war. Tactical manuals do not recommend bagpipes as standard operating procedure, but they do recommend confusing and unbalancing the enemy in ways that diminish their capacity to fight. That connection between the incongruous and the effective is probably the most durable lesson of Churchill's career. He demonstrated that the soldier's toolkit is not only hardware, and that soft tools, timing, strangeness, symbolic threat can shift outcomes. The commando's later institutionalization into special operations units kept that ethos alive while formalizing training, doctrine, and control mechanisms to reduce the recklessness that unchecked eccentricity might bring. Yet, for all his historical utility as a case study, Mad Jack also remained a public figure whose personal peculiarities fascinated ordinary readers. He was an oddity who refused to fit the tidy roles that peacetime societies offer: veteran, worker, quietly retired officer. He lectured, he entertained, he continued to practice the old arts he had carried into war. For many of his contemporaries, that was part of his charm. For others, it was an irritation. But in the end, his persistence in being exactly himself, a stubborn oxymoron of the modern soldier and the medieval reenactor, was his defining attribute. Perhaps the most instructive way to read his life is through the interplay of method and personality. Method is teachable. Small units can rehearse shock tactics until they become reflex. Personality is not always teachable, nor should it be artificially manufactured. Churchill offered an authentic model of using a life's oddities as instruments of effect. He did not fake eccentricity for impact. Eccentricity was his underlying preference. The risk, then and now, is in assuming that any unconventional appearance automatically translates into effectiveness. Churchill's record is valuable precisely because it shows both the possible successes and the costs. He is a reminder that audacity can be tactical genius when properly bounded and sheer madness when unchecked. When historians trace the genealogy of modern special operations, they find in Mad Jack a figure who crystallized an ethic more than a technology. The ethic was this: warfare is partly a contest of wills and perceptions. If you can change what the enemy believes about the battlefield, you change the likely outcome. That truth, abstractly stated, underwrites much of the modern approach to targeted raids, deception operations, and psychological operations. The longbow, in that sense, was merely a memorable instance of an older principle applied in a modern war. The public appetite for sensational lines, like the title our story began with, helps explain why legends proliferate. The claim that he felled 7 German sergeants in 3 days is the kind of photographable sentence newspapers and memoirs loved then and often repeat now. It condenses the man into an image both arresting and convenient. The loner who turned the tide in a frantic retreat. Responsible historians treat such claims with caution. Many contemporaries and later writers described incidents in compressed terms, sometimes combining separate skirmishes into a single dramatic arc. When the numbers are not corroborated by firm documentation, they should be presented as reported or as mythic condensation rather than as established fact. The exactitude of a historian's ledger requires those qualifiers. But the cultural force of the claim, what it did for morale and storytelling, is itself a fact. It spread, it inspired, and it shaped perceptions of what the commandos represented. It is worth pausing on the human cost again. War stories that glorify the dash of a sword risk overlooking the people on the other side of a blade or an arrow. Each enemy soldier who surrendered, each sergeant felled, had a life that was rearranged or ended. Responsible narrative keeps that in view. Churchill did not seek theatricality for its own sake. He used it instrumentally. Yet the moral ledger cannot be balanced by tactical brilliance alone. Remembering that keeps the admiration we feel for daring from tipping into unexamined celebration. Time, as it often does, softened some edges and hardened others. Veterans who had served under or alongside Mad Jack told stories in pubs and regimental reunions. The stories changed, as they do, with retelling. Some details waxed into legend, others shrank as inconvenient. The fuller picture, gradually pieced together by researchers who combed archives and compared eyewitnesses, presents a man who was complex and often contradictory. Disciplined yet restlessly theatrical, brave yet sometimes reckless, inspiring yet occasionally arrogant in a way that complicated command relationships. That complexity is the more human and, arguably, the more instructive part of his legacy. In museums and film reels, the man is often reduced to iconic images: an officer with a broadsword, a picture of a longbow, a set of bagpipes leaning against a crate. Those images are useful because they are memorable, but the more consequential lessons of his life are tactical and ethical. How to harness surprise without courting avoidable loss, how to combine theater with operational discipline, how to integrate individual courage into a collective chain of command that protects as well as empowers. As the decades advanced and the institutional descendants of the commandos matured into elite units with standardized training, many of Churchill's individual habits were set aside as idiosyncrasies better left to memoirs than to doctrine. Still, those institutions did not jettison the principle that he embodied: create confusion, seize initiative, be quicker to interpret and act than your enemy. That thread, traceable through special operations history, acknowledges that not every useful idea has to come from a textbook. Some come from men who lived dangerously and learned from doing. Late in life, Mad Jack reflected publicly and privately on what he had done. He often insisted that his eccentric weapons were never mere props. They were part of an identity that gave him steadiness in the sudden, chaotic moments of combat.
He argued, with characteristic bluntness, that a leader must be willing to stand where danger is dense and to be seen standing there. Yet he also recognized, in quieter moments, that war is a terrible business, one that leaves marks invisible to metals. He visited graves, he corresponded with former comrades, and he sometimes spoke with a tenderness about lost friends that contradicted the caricature of a man who never felt the weight of death. The final image of his life, perhaps inevitably, is a montage. The slow pull of the bowstring, the drone of bagpipes over surf and hills, the flash of a broadsword in early light, and then, in later years, small domestic stunts that kept him from succumbing entirely to peacetime tedium. That montage both honors and complicates the man. It invites admiration without insisting on uncritical worship. It invites curiosity about how singular individuals can influence institutional practices, and how personality can sometimes be a force multiplier in war. So what does his story teach beyond the sparkle of oddity? For military thinkers, it is a reminder to attend to the human elements of conflict, morale, surprise, and the willingness to break a script that enemies expect. For citizens and students of history, it is a study in the double-edged nature of legend. Heroes are useful in hard times, but we must measure the stories we tell against the grain of evidence and the weight of consequences. For anyone wondering whether theatricality can be weaponized effectively, his career demonstrates that it can, but not without cost and not without careful judgment. When the tide of history turned and anniversaries arrived, Mad Jack's story was told in classrooms, on documentary screens, and in books that tried to sort the man from the myth. The tone usually shifted between affectionate amusement and sober respect. That balance, of laughing with him, not at him, and of admiring the courage while acknowledging the pain, seems the most honest posture. In closing, the arrow that began this tale, the one that sailed through morning mist and fell into a hedgerow, still carries rhetorical weight. It is a symbol of a man who refused to fold his identity before necessity, and who believed that oddness itself could be a form of tactical leverage. The recorded shot at Lepene, described in some contemporaneous accounts as the first confirmed longbow kill in centuries, is emblematic rather than dispositive. Whether or not the precise numbers of other claims, like the oft-recounted 7 sergeants in 3 days, stand up to strict archival scrutiny, the aggregate testimony points to a real effect. Churchill's presence changed the way small engagements unfolded and shaped the imaginations of men who would become the founders of modern special operations.
History is comfortable with paradox. Churchill's life dwells in that space, audacious and grave, odd and disciplined, celebrated and contested. The legend was a useful thing in dark years. The man was, regardless of legend, an officer who pursued what he believed to be effective and who paid for that pursuit alongside others. If you take any single lesson from his story, let it be this: the instruments we choose to carry into battle are less important than the clarity of purpose with which we carry them. A longbow will not win a war by itself, but in the right hand, used with intent and imagination, even anachronism can become a lever. If this account has drawn you into the strange currents of wartime innovation and character, there are more stories like this waiting in the archives. Men who reshaped combat not simply by technology, but by temperament. Subscribe for deeper dives into history's strangest warriors, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and whether Mad Jack was new to you or an old legend.